So, hi everyone, my name is Michelle Planche, and welcome to this segment of Event TV. Right now, Event TV is going virtual. We are going online to have weekly chats called Knowledge is Currency. So, each week we will chat with a different entrepreneur about a different topic that affects entrepreneurs every day in their business and will hopefully help you grow your business. So today we are going to be chatting with Donna Bishop. Donna is the host and founder of Fashion Talks, and she is also the director of development for CAFA. Donna is going to walk us through her experience of getting a podcast online and some really great tips to building your business through a podcast. So stay tuned.
Anyone can start a podcast, but because anyone can start a podcast, there are, as I'm sure you've all experienced, thousands and thousands of podcasts out there. And especially as we've been in quarantine, I've noticed more and more celebrities or higher profile people are jumping on the podcasting bandwagon. And you might have even seen that depending on who you follow and where you are looking. If you're cruising through the new and noteworthy podcasts on iTunes or on Spotify, I'm sure you've seen more and more kind of high profile people popping up and having a podcast. Do not let that intimidate you. If your goal is, I want to be like the podcast with 1 billion subscribers and, be the Oprah or the Dax Shepard or the John Mulaney of podcasting, then I would say manage your expectations. It's kind of like moving to, Los Angeles and saying, I want to be the next Julia Roberts, but that doesn't mean that it isn't going to have immense value for you and for your business. So if you've kind of moved through that process and you're like, yes, I've decided I want to start a podcast, then the next decision is, what is the type of podcast I want to start? And what I mean by that is, are you going to be what's called a single voice podcast, which is just your voice kind of narrating a presentation or a keynote or like reading an essay aloud? If anyone listens to Under the Influence, Terry O'Reilly's marketing and advertising podcast, are people familiar with him? He's a CBC. If you haven't listened to him, he's amazing, but he's an excellent example of a single voice podcast. Or are you going to be what's called like a chat cast, where you're actually bringing guests on and you're interviewing them? That's what I do with Fashion Talks. Is it's more of an interactive back and forth with either me and one other guest, or I've actually done it as well with a small group of guests. Maximum I would recommend is being 3. Or are you doing a narrative or an investigative podcast, which tends to be a little more production value heavy? And what I mean by that is, you might have heard like maybe someone knows something, or the fridge light where you hear sound effects and there's music that feeds in and out. And the nature of the podcast is actually telling a story, or there's a single narrative that weaves through it. So those are 3 kind of main buckets, unless you're trying to do something creative and you're starting like a comedy podcast, or you've got a screenplay or an audio book that's been burning inside you and you want to release that in chapters as podcasts. Those are other formats to use. Are most people, can I just get kind of a beat, are most people thinking about this as a marketing vehicle, or are you thinking about it as a creative vehicle? Janet, I know you're probably marketing, right?
Yeah. And
I'm thinking both. Yeah, I'm thinking both.
You're thinking both, Karen?
Yeah, I did some podcasts a number of years ago in the US actually, and really enjoyed them. And it was more to I don't know, I guess it would fit into the investigative narrative, and there was always somebody like we had I wrote the script, but there was always somebody else interjecting and asking me questions and stuff, and it was about the retail industry basically. So.
And Clea, are you thinking of it more from a business point of view as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Marketing.
Okay, and I apologize. I know there's more people on the call, so my apologies that I haven't called you out by name. So that's great. It can be a really, really valuable thing to use as a marketing tool, not just because it is a way to reach potentially new clients or new customers, but it also allows you to maybe piggyback onto an experience or something that they're having within your business already, or as a way to deepen the relationship that your clients have with your business. So I'm just going to sort of pull examples off the top of my head with a bit of what you guys have shared. Janet, you could use it as a way to, release chapters of your book, or to interview people that have gone through your program, or experts about the benefit of play. Clee, you could, have different vendors on to talk about, what's right about what their wines are like, or the art of winemaking. Like, there are so many avenues that I can see all of you going through with this. Michelle, if she was starting a podcast, could do one on, tips for entrepreneurs, and interviewing different entrepreneurs, not unlike the podcast I Built This, which is a Guy Raz podcast, which is also excellent if you haven't listened to it. So the first step, like so many things, is just getting pretty clear at the beginning about what your goal is and what your format is, so that you have a place to start. And like any endeavor, it will ebb and flow and change. And as you do things, you'll realize what's working and what's not. An example of that I've experienced is when I started Fashion Talks, and I started it back in the summer of 2017, is I started it originally to have panel discussions about the role fashion plays in our culture. So I saw it as being these very esoteric conversations with leaders in the industry, and we would talk about the democratization of fashion and what was happening in 1987 that made it the perfect timing for Anna Wintour to pair a Christian Lacroix sweatshirt with a pair of Guess jeans and begin the high-low trend, and the fact that fashion television was starting at the same time, and how did all these things play in together. And I certainly did several of those, and they were great. But what I started to do was, when I had maybe a gap and I wanted to make sure that I was maintaining my release schedule, is I would have a designer or someone from the industry on, and we would do what I called a designer spotlight, and have a really detailed one-on-one conversation that wasn't about what inspires them as a designer, but it was about, what kind of kid were you growing up? And when did you realize fashion was something that was more than just clothes to cover your body? And do you remember what your portfolio for design school was like? Or did you go to design school? And kind of connecting the dots of all of the ways their past has kind of led them to where they are now. And what ended up happening was, those were the episodes that were getting way more lift and engagement than the panel discussions that I had started with. So I decided to pivot, and I was just following the downloads and following the feedback. And now I almost exclusively do those one-on-one interviews. So that's just an idea of, you need to be a little bit nimble and kind of see what's working. So once you've decided on you've got your format, you know what your goals are, there are some things that you need to do to prepare. So before you even start writing your first script, and it delights me that so many of you have said script already, because this is not an ad-libbing format. So the first decision is, where do I want to host it? And by that I mean, your podcast has an RSS feed. That is the thing that allows it to be pushed out to iTunes and Spotify and Google Play and all of those things. It needs to live somewhere. And this is one of the places where you're absolutely going to have to spend money. You're absolutely going to have to spend money with a service that hosts your podcast. SoundCloud is a really popular one. Blueberry is another one that's excellent. Spotify has just come out with one called Soundtrap that you can use. Those are all ones that I would recommend, because they all do a couple of really important features. They all automatically will help share you to iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, Stitcher. Like, the number of podcatchers increase every single day. So it sends to all of those. It will produce what's called an audio burst, which is where you can create an audio clip with a graphic of your podcast that allows you to share it on social media like Instagram or YouTube, something like that. And they help provide you with analytics, so you can see beyond your Google Analytics. All of these will have analytics around where the download's coming from geographically, how long are people staying on for, so you can see how long they listen to, that sort of thing. And they all will hold that RSS feed for you. So any of those are really great. The thing with podcasting as well is new things are happening all the time, especially in this time of COVID, where people have or the organizations have realized that more and more people are actually tuning into podcasts and producing podcasts, that more places to work with podcasting has come on the market. And what I mean by that is I just saw today that Spotify has launched something called Anchor, which looks really worthwhile looking into, because what it is it's a service that will turn your Zoom or YouTube Live or House Party or any of these features into an MP4 and an MP4A, so that you're able to actually capture the video as well as export the audio only. So you actually are getting a video cast and a podcast at the same time. So those, knowing where you're going to host is really, really important. So that's one of your first big decisions. This is after, of course, you've thought of like your name, and these all have your URL as well. So I use Blueberry. SoundCloud wasn't around when I started, but they both are, I would say, comparable. So I have a website that's fashiontalks.ca. That is a WordPress site that's linked to Blueberry, because I wanted to be able to put up, different images and stuff like that. So it's a WordPress plugin, but you can go just through SoundCloud. You don't need to have a different address or anything like that, but it's a website that'll be like Janet's Podcast for Play, hosted on SoundCloud, and you don't need another website in order to do that. So digging into the right hosting service is kind of one of your first decisions. Once you've decided about that, then it's about, how am I going to record it? And this is what is so exciting, because you don't need to buy anything. Like, you don't need to get a new microphone. You don't need to invest in anything like that. Before COVID, I would often rent mics from Long and McQuaid, and I would go meet people, in their hotel suite or in their office if they were local, if they weren't able to meet me in a studio, and we would have the two mics and record that way. But you can record, like, honestly, from your earbuds on your phone and make an excellent recording. If you're doing it with a guest, there are all kinds, any of those like video chats like Zoom, like Anchor, like Squadcast. And there's one more, sorry, that's called, Zencaster. And I'll email all of these to Michelle so that she can push them out to you, or I'll put them in chats after. Sorry, I'm doing this on my phone, or I would be putting them in the notes. These are all the ways where you're going to actually do the recording. So you're hosting it on SoundCloud, say, but then you're going to use one of these other services to actually record, just like we do with Zoom. And Michelle said at the beginning, do you guys mind if I record it? Very, very similar formatting to that. What you want to look for is making sure that however you record gives each audio person their own channel per se. So you're not getting, it's like a rope. You're not getting one piece of string that everyone's voices are in. You're getting a braid. You're getting two audio channels that you can control the levels of. The beautiful, and I'm sorry, I sound like there's going to be a lot of post-production. There's not. But these are just things that you want to look for in order to minimize the amount of post-production work that you're going to have to do, because I'm all about doing the bulk of the work at the beginning and making my post-production really, really easy, because I didn't want to become a sound engineer in all of my spare time. So I'll tell you a little bit more about what my process is at the end that helps streamline that. So once you know where you're recording, we'll talk about how to do a great recording in a sec. Just the final piece that's like techie is, do you want to do any post-production work? That might be what I do at a bare minimum, which is fading music in at the beginning and fading music out at the end. Some people like to record a standard introduction and a standard ending combined with the music, so you can just tag that on at the beginning and the end of your conversation, which is also a really, really, really helpful thing to do. One of the best, and it's free, pieces of software to do that is something called Audacity. It's really, really easy to use. You download your MP3 recording onto it, and it's within that program that you manipulate it, and you might play with a level a little bit, or if you were someone who wanted to be really fancy and add sound effects and, you know, clip different pieces of interviews together, this is the program which you would do all of that in. I like to keep it super, super simple. I add something at the beginning and I add something at the end, and that's it. Once you have done that, then you export that into your MP3, and that's what you then upload back into wherever you're hosting. And that is what ultimately gets pushed out to the world as your podcast. Now, if I've made your head explode, because that all sounds very techy and complicated, it's not as complicated as it sounds. It's a little like learning any other kind of new language. There are different steps, but the steps themselves are very, very simple. So please, I don't want to intimidate you. I just wanted to lay out exactly what some of the steps are for making that recording. Before I go into some of the more fun stuff, which is creating the content, are there any questions about any of that techie stuff? And like I said, I'll email Michelle with all of those links and recap some of the things I've said, because I know that can be a lot to take in if you've never done something like that before.
I just have a question, Donna, about maybe you'll get into this, but the platforms in which to share it. Is that something you'll get into later? Or?
Like iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, all of those sorts of things? Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
The simple answer to that, Michelle, is cast your net wide. Like currently, it is free. The only thing of all of these things that you've had to pay for so far is where you host the site. And then most of those other services have a free option, or you can pay a little bit, like on Squadcaster or Zencaster or Zoom. There might be a nominal fee if you are, you know, small, or you are only going to be releasing like one podcast most of them have like an hour maximum per month, or a gig maximum per month. Anyone who's just starting out like this would never need to do more than whatever the lowest denominator of like the one up from free is. So it's still pretty nominal. Like I'd say from a costing perspective, we're still well under $100 a month to do this so far. The great thing is to send to iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, Google Play, Stitcher, Peapod, all of these different platforms. It's all free. In any of those, wherever your RSS feed is living, it will have buttons there where you say share here, share here, share here, share here, share here. And once you've set everything up once, it's like the podcast fairies just make it happen. Once you have it all set up and you upload your first one, whenever you upload things afterwards, you never need to readjust those settings. It all just goes. So my advice for where to put your podcast is cast your net wide and put it on as many platforms as possible.
My last question, and then I'll see if anyone else has questions, is do you need to actually host it on its own site, or can it not just go from a recording to iTunes or to all those platforms? Okay,
it needs to have a place for your RSS feed to live.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah. So even if you don't use it as a website per se, like I know lots of podcasts that just have it as like a landing page. And it's like, this is the podcast, and there might be links to their episodes below that. It doesn't need to be fancy, but you need one of those sites in order to have a place for that RSS feed to live.
Okay, cool. Anyone else have any technical questions before we move on?
No one's in the fetal position or drinking martinis yet as a result of all that tech talk?
Soon. It's almost 5 o'clock.
Exactly. It's happy hour somewhere, right? So once you've got all of that kind of like, you know, you've got your hosting, you know what formats you're going to use, you know what you're going to use to record, then the exciting stuff really happens. And it's about, how do I prepare? What do I want to do in order to, you know, make it a really engaging and successful podcast? How do I make sure I'm sounding, you know, bright and engaging on the podcast? Because like blogging, there's more great content than any of us can possibly hope to consume ourselves. I know even just looking at like the videos that are out there in terms of like Netflix and Amazon and Apple Plus and this, that, and the next thing, there is more there's more narrative content, video that's been recorded than I can consume. It's the same for podcasting. So a couple of things that I would recommend in order to make sure people become engaged as quickly as possible is, one is your length. So you might notice that podcasts can range from anywhere from 11 minutes to like an hour and a half. I have found in the past that the sweet spot, especially when you're starting out, is between 20 and 30 minutes. It tends to be, back in the days when we commuted places, kind of a good length of time for people if they were in their car or on the subway, which statistically is one of the most popular places where people have consumed podcasts in the past. But especially as you're starting out, that is a really manageable amount of time. You will be surprised how much work it is to create a podcast. So having it be longer than that can be really, really tricky, especially if you are doing a single voice podcast. If it's something where you just want to share your knowledge, it's just you talking, keeping energy up for that long, if you're not used to it, can be a real challenge. So I would recommend between 15 and 30 minutes at the absolute max as you're starting out. The beautiful thing about podcasting is you can always do differently the next time. And I guarantee you, most of you will look at your very first episode and like cringe and cry at the idea of putting out into the world, because it might not be exactly what you wanted it to be like. You might hear things in the background you didn't want to hear. You might be like, oh, that music isn't available. Get it out in the world. It is always better to start it and get it out there and build on it than fret about making it perfect, especially right now. Now is such an exciting time to start a podcast because people's tolerance for perfection is so high. People are watching Jimmy Fallon in his living room. Like the whole notion of picture perfect production values is gone. So use that as a real freedom in order to start this endeavor for yourself, because if it sounds a little bit crackly, no one's going to care. Which brings me to a point I forgot to bring up when it comes to the actual recording, just to get back to being technical for a second. The most important thing when it comes to doing your recording, in order to get your sound as good as possible so you don't need to do work in post-production, is having quiet where you record. And this is going to sound possibly silly to some of you, but one of the best places to record is in your bedroom closet. The reason for that is because, I know, I see you giggling out there. The reason is because all that fabric absorbs the sound. If you've ever been in a restaurant where there isn't like drapes or a carpet, you can sort of, you hear that like ding, 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 ding. The sound like bounces off of all the hard surfaces. It's like playing squash. The squash ball is the sound, and when all the walls are hard, it just zings all over the place. That's what can make it echoey. So you want to record in a place that is going to absorb the sound as much as possible. And where most of us have that environment is in our closets. I have been a guest on podcasts where they have invited me into like the very small closet, and we've sat with like jackets over our heads to record. So that is one of the best places to do it. If you're not going to do it in your closet, which you certainly don't have to, you want to make sure you're in a place that is quiet with as much fabric around you as possible. So if you have like a finished basement with lots of, plush pillows and stuff like that, that might be a good option. You're just going to want to be aware of things like, is your air conditioning going to pop on without you knowing it, and that's going to create sound? Are there other humans or animals in your house that might unpredictably, call down the stairs or bark or make noise? Again, these aren't deal breakers, but they're just things to think about when you're setting yourself up to do the recording. So those are a couple of things to think about. But honestly, like you and your laptop in your bedroom closet, you will get great sound from. You can even, if you're down in a basement or something, if you take like a duvet or a blanket and you just sort of cocoon it around yourself like that, that really, really, really helps absorb the sound and will create a better end product than if you didn't do it. So that's something you can even experiment with, just recording onto your like voice memos on your cell phone, is try in different parts of your house with different intensities of fabrics, and you'll get a sense of how the sound sounds different in different parts of the house. The other thing when it comes to recording is, I think everyone has heard that terrible, though often true, adage that the camera adds 20 pounds. The microphone zaps you of 20% of your energy. So I might talk, if I was talking in real life and Michelle and I were just having a conversation, I would probably talk maybe something like this. How that translates into your ear is very, very different than when you're engaging in real life. So when you're talking on your podcast, I always say, think of it as you just had that extra cup of coffee, like you're a little bit brighter, you sit up a little bit straighter, you want to have energy in your voice. Again, it will sound possibly odd because listening to ourselves speak, if it's not something you're used to, can sound incredibly strange. It can even be uncomfortable. Go with it. The end result will be so much more engaging if you think about having that little bit more energy in your voice as you're recording. So now you've got like all these tips, this is all swimming around in your head. Now it's time to prepare for your episode. So now whether you are doing something with a guest or you're doing something on your own, you're going to want to have a script. And that script is what your introduction is going to be. Your script is how you're going to introduce the episode, be it because you're introducing a guest or because you're introducing like the topic that you're going to talk about. And this is where you can really take some time to think about, what do you want to do that's going to make this kind of like special or unique for you? And you might not think of it right off the top. It might come as you go along. But again, like Terry O'Reilly's Under the Influence, he starts off every episode with a little story or anecdote that is seemingly unrelated to what he's going to talk about in the episode, but then he always brings it back around at the end and the dots connect, and it's really interesting and engaging. You don't need to do it that way. It's just an idea. But it is fascinating how easily it is to get nervous or get a little bit shy when we're recording something. So don't be afraid. Like honestly, up until just a little while ago, I would have my, hi, I'm Donna Bishop, the host of Fashion Talks podcast, with like a little thing here, just so you have the security of knowing exactly what you're going to say. It like gives your brain a little bit of a life jacket in order to know that you've got this, you're following the script, all is well. So if you are doing something with a guest, then the decision becomes, how are you and the guest going to prepare for this interview? And there might be opportunities where the guest isn't available for the kind of preparation that you would prefer, and that's something to kind of roll with. Often what I like to do when possible is have a pre-interview call with the guest. So it's not recorded. I don't send questions in advance. I just want to talk about like get to know them a little bit so that when we get on the podcast, there's a bit of a rapport between us. I will inevitably learn things in that pre-chat that I couldn't find out doing research online, and that like sparks something in my head. So that's a process that I really like when it's available to me, is scheduling that advanced call so that we can have like a pre-chat, which is something that if you work in network, lifestyle television, or sometimes on larger radio shows, that would be what the producer does before the guest comes on the air. So it's not an uncommon ask or approach, but people might not always have the time to do that. So that's when you need to kind of think, okay, well, if that's the process I want and they're not available, do I say thanks very much and wait and have them another time? Or am I willing to be flexible and maybe tweak my process a little bit? And that might be, you send the guest questions in advance so that they know kind of what you're going to ask about. Maybe they send you the answers back, so you have a little bit of an idea of what some of their answers are, so you have a foundation for the conversation. It's not a script per se, but it gives you some knowledge about what your conversation might look like. Or some people just don't have the time and they're like, send me 5 questions and we'll just roll with it. And all of that, the decision as to what you do is really based on how comfortable are you feeling about the interview? Is it someone you know already? Because when you are just starting, of course, I always say we all have our kind of A-list ideas and our B-list ideas, right? So if I was starting off right at the beginning, I wouldn't go after one of my A-list ideas or my A-list guests, because I would want to gain some comfort and confidence, not to devalue them, but with one of my like B guest ideas or B ideas that I wanted to explore. Or maybe it's someone who I just know really well, so I'm going to be comfortable with them, and that makes making that first one easier. So, you know, Clee, just using you as an example, you know, maybe if you were doing an interview-based one of your first interviewers, first people you interview would be someone that you know really well from the Mission Hill group of wines, or it's someone within the organization. So you already have that rapport, and that can give you a little bit more warmth and a little bit more comfort and confidence going into the interview.
Right, okay.
And I always say to people, because I don't want to do edits and post, like I said, I have no desire to be a sound engineer because that is a lot of work. I always give the disclaimer up ahead that unless they, you know, have a heart attack or scream, you know, they're going to shoot the prime minister, whatever is said on that recording is what's going on air, which has the advantage of having a kind of like sparky, spontaneous kind of feel and vibe, which I really like. It also keeps your guest on their toes and doesn't give them the opportunity to say, oh my God, can I say that again? Like, even if you sneeze, it's like, it's in there. So that might be something to consider as well. And again, as you do your first episode and your second episode and your third episode and your 20th episode, you'll get a sense of what process you like, as to, you know, how, you know, you might discover you love sound editing and you're fine to do things like later in Audacity. It's all really about figuring out what part of this new media resonates with you. And you might also go like, holy cow, I had no idea. I'm going to become a patron and listen only. This is ridiculous. So give yourself that kind of freedom to figure out what you like, because I will be straight up with you. It is quite a bit of work. It is not something that you can kind of just put together in an hour. It does take quite a bit of time. Rewarding, but it does take time. So once you've, you know, done all of that, you've got your recording, you've put it through Audacity, you've got it on your RSS feed, it's going out into the world. There are a few other things to keep in mind, because now you've created this beautiful thing, but how in the world are people going to know about it so that they can find you and listen to it? So there are a couple of things that are important. Some of it is, you know, good old social media and knowing, you know, I don't do anything for Fashion Talks on Twitter because it's such a visual podcast that I focus only on Instagram. So you might, but if you are more of a political podcast, the visuals might not make a difference to you, and you want to use Twitter exclusively because then you can push out, you know, lots of little bits about it. So what I often say is look at the people who've done something similar and have more money than you do, and look at what they're doing, because they probably know something and have done the R&D to learn something you didn't know. So look at some of your favorite podcasts. Where do they share their stories? What are they sharing on social media? How are they marketing their podcasts is often a really great place to go to kind of get a sense of what you could be doing. It's a slow burn at the beginning. Something to keep in mind is, especially on iTunes, for that new and noteworthy area where you log on and you see all those things that come up first. Getting on that is algorithm based, and it's based on having an amount of downloads in a very short period of time. So, and that is constantly changing. It's kind of like Instagram or Facebook. The algorithms are always changing. There are lots of articles that kind of keep you on top of that. But it's getting harder and harder to get into that spotlight, especially because now what's happening is there are podcasting networks of sorts, like you've seen probably iHeartRadio or Panoply or Wondery, CBC. All of these organizations are now, it's not unlike network television was in the 70s and 80s, where they have a suite of shows and producers and are helping push different things out. Now, does that mean don't do a podcast because you won't get like in that primetime spot? Absolutely not. If you are a business where you already have like this amazing database and you already have clients and you already have a network of people that you engage with, those are your first people to launch the podcast with. So please don't stress about not being in any of those like top lines on those big platforms, because that's becoming harder and harder and harder with every passing day. But you want to be sure that you are sending it out to the people who already know you. Is it your newsletter database? Is it your colleagues and your students? Is it your personal network? Is it over LinkedIn? Is it any of these places where you already have a community of people that you can reach out to? Don't be afraid to ask your network for help. So here's my first podcast. It'd be great if you can share it with, 5 of your friends. I think you're really going to like it. Or what are the other organizations that would be interested in the information that you are talking about? So if you are doing a hospitality podcast around beverages, reach out to some people you might know in the food industry, and maybe there's an opportunity to cross-pollinate. Similarly, podcasters love to support other podcasters. So if someone else is kind of new and you guys might have a similar audience, then maybe you create a bit of a partnership where you both say at various points in maybe it's traditionally at the end, but it could be in the middle. If you love listening to Michelle Planche's entrepreneurial podcast, then you're really going to love Phoenix Paul's podcast on scaling your business, blah, 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 where the audiences would be similar and you guys can promote each other's podcasts on your own stream. That's a great way to do it. In terms of revenue, because I know that's something that probably a lot of people ask about, there are basically 3 revenue streams currently for podcasting. There is sponsorship. This podcast is brought to you by Audible, audible.com, blah, 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 blah. There is advertising. Often the host is the one. It's almost like radio in the, 30s and 40s, where the host is the one that reads an ad and creates some content around it. The people at Vanity Fair do that very, very well if you listen to any of their podcasts. And then there's something called Patreon. And Patreon is kind of like crowdsourcing for creatives, where you can register there as a content creator. It's podcasters, it's visual artists, it's filmmakers, it's all kinds of things. And it's basically people saying, you know what, I love Michelle's podcast. I'm going to give her $5 a month so that she can continue to do that. Or $100 once, or whatever. But it's basically a way for your listeners, your fans, your community to support you if that is something that you would like to do.
Almost like a subscription.
A little bit. And lots of times with Patreon, like what Slate does is most of the time, so there are 2 things that Patreon does. Sometimes it's just like, hey, in order to produce this podcast, it's X, Y, and Z. And if you could please give me some money, that would be great. Sometimes it's, if you are a Patreon subscriber to this podcast, then you get something special. It might be ad-free podcasts. It might be an additional bit of content like excerpts, or something special that you do at the end just for Patreon people. Maybe those Patreon people the people who subscribe and support you can submit questions that you then insert into the interview at the end. Like, it's an opportunity to kind of think creatively about what additional value could you give these people in exchange for them supporting you financially with your podcast. I really want to reiterate that it is rewarding and wonderful. It is a lot of work, and all of that techie stuff, I'm not a techie person. So all of that tech stuff, while it seems perhaps like a lot or overwhelming, once you get into the groove of it, it is not complicated. It's just process.